We're going to now move on with our program by introducing our next speaker. She's known throughout the world as one of America's finest authors. She is here today to share some about her work in her adoptive home of France during the Great War. Please help me in welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning author Edith Wharton.
I hear the drums of war pounding. The year is 1933 and Hitler has just been elected Chancellor of Germany. Mussolini and Franco are spreading political fear, and I am afraid that we will be at war again. I lived through the Great War. I know the devastation that war brings. But then my life has been bracketed by war. I was born during the American Civil War. Not that my family paid much mind. We were New York high society. My mother was far more interested in the fashions she brought back from Paris every spring that were the envy of all New York. Oh, you see, my maiden name is Jones. We were the Joneses, everyone was keeping up with. That's where the phrase comes from my mother's wardrobe. But for the most part, I lived in Europe as a child and came to know the beauty and the art and the architecture of the old world. I spoke, by the time I was 4 years old, fluent Italian, German, and French. When we lived in Paris, every Sunday, a kindly old gentleman would come to visit and have lunch, after which I would clamber upon his lap and he would tell me stories of Greek mythology. What blessings I have heaped upon the head of the teller. Even as a very young child, Mother Goose and fairy tales left me indifferent, but the domestic tales of the gods of Olympus aroused my childhood curiosity, and I wanted to create stories of my own. It was quite a ritual. I called it making up. I would have a book in my hand, even though I couldn't read, and sometimes it was upside down. I still managed to turn the pages and spout forth my fantastical stories. I continued this as we lived in Florence and eventually in America. Now, I didn't go to school. I had a governess, Anna Ballman, who fed my mind with a wealth of literature and poetry. My parents' contribution to my education was a reverence for the English language. But you see, in that society to which they belonged, only two things, what was most important was having good manners. And to speak improperly was considered bad manners. My mother used to say the only thing that was important to her was to have good manners and have a lot of money. But I loved to read. This society to which my mother and father belonged did not value intellectualism. My father had a fine library, but never read the books. My mother was quite perplexed when I announced that I wished to read, and I wished to write. I wrote stories and poems. My parents didn't want to encourage me, so they wouldn't buy me any paper. I took to begging for the brown paper wrapping that was wrapped around packages delivered to our back door. I didn't think to cut it down to size. I just spread it on the floor and wrote in long columns. My mother was afraid that I would be an intellectual. Edith, she'd say, who would marry an intellectual? But despite her trepidations, I made my society debut and survived the empty gaiety of several seasons when I met the man I would marry. Teddy Wharton, a friend of my brother's, about 10 years older than I. He had a boyish charm and a good sense of humor, and we agreed to be married. Now, the first house we purchased was in Newport. It overlooked the ocean. The views were stunning, but the house was ugly. We hired an architect from Boston, Ogden Cudman Jr., to help us renovate the exterior as well as the interior. Oh, this was not done. This was the height of Victorian culture. And the interiors were left to upholsterers who covered every square inch with embroidery and velvet and festoons of lace and silver gewgaws. But both Ogden and I disliked these excesses, and we drifted toward the idea of writing a book. And then we had to find a way to publish it. We were laughed at everywhere we went. Who would buy a book from two unknown designers with an outlandish idea such as that? But I had another possibility. You see, several years earlier, I had sent 3 of my poems to 3 leading magazines. I had no idea how to approach a publisher or an editor. I simply put the poem in an envelope with my society calling card. No address, no cover letter, but all three were accepted. I will never forget the sensation of opening those acceptance letters. I would run up and down the stairs with the exuberance of a 10-year-old child, even though I was a mature woman of 30. But one of those publishers was Scribner's, and they began to ask for my stories and poems to be published in their magazine. And so I went to them and asked if they would publish our book, The Decoration of Houses. Now, it wasn't what they normally published, but they wanted my stories. And so they agreed to bring out a small edition, thinking it would just be a gift book for my friends. It sold out. The second printing sold out. And the third, then it was published in England. And to this very day, it continues to bring a royalty to its astonished authors. Everyone was tired of those excesses of high Victorian culture, and it became the touchstone of taste to use our book to decorate one's house. So my first acclaim began with that book, but my literary career really began with Scribner's. As they published my poems and stories in their magazines, I would have a pleasant flutter seeing my name in print. A magazine would be thrown away each month, but still I was printed. And then, in 1899, the most remarkable thing happened. Scribner's brought out a book of my collected stories. I had written stories worthy of preservation. Was it the same insignificant I that I had always known? I felt as if that book, it was called The Greater Inclination, helped me discover my soul. My family wasn't as enthusiastic. No one in my family ever mentioned my writing, either to praise or to blame. My cousins treated me as though I were a family disgrace. To become a writer, I had to fight my way through a fog of indifference, if not tacit disapproval. But I didn't care. I was a writer, and I wanted to talk about writing with other people. A friend suggested my husband and I go to London, for surely somebody there would talk to me about books. We went to, when I got there, I went to a bookseller, for I wanted to be able to hold my own in a conversation. And I asked what people were reading these days. And he handed me a book and said, "This is what everyone in London is talking about." It was my book. His amazement was as great as mine. I should have liked to have followed up this first glimpse of success, but my husband was tended to be depressed, and he grew depressed in London, and we came home to America. But I had found my creative zeal. I brought out a book of short stories and my first novel, and then I had the idea for another novel about society life in New York. Now, fate had conspired to set me in high society, and my instincts as a storyteller told me I should write about what I know. But though this was the early 1900s, people were only supposed to write about the common man. So here is my problem. How could I take something as frivolous as New York society and find something significant? And the answer was my character, Lily Bart, in the book, The House of Mirth. It was an instant success, solidifying me as one of the most important writers of the day. It also gave me some financial independence, and in 1907, my husband and I decided to sell our New York house and get a flat in Paris. The winters were harsh and increasingly dark in New York, and my husband had some severe mental problems, increasing depression and such. And so we would go to Paris because it's easy to go south for sunshine from Paris. We lived in that flat until after the war. Those first years were happy, amiable years. As I look back upon the chaos that war has brought to us and the ruins heaped upon our door, I look at those years as if in a glass bubble. Happiness and joy. We had friends, and I was quite indulged, for I was a successful writer. A friend's translation of my book, The House of Mirth, had just been brought out, and this is the difference between New York and Paris. In Paris, no one can live without literature, whereas in New York, I was treated as a pariah. But we still came home to America, to our home in America for the summer. But those glowing summer weeks were overshadowed by a creeping darkness in my husband's brain. He became more and more alternating between severe depression and outrageous manic episodes. My friends became worried for my safety. His family refused to acknowledge it, even though his father had had the same condition, but soon it became apparent that he could no longer live a normal life, and I could not manage the house on my own. And so we sold the house. I returned to Paris, never again to live in America. Teddy stayed with his family in Boston. And in 1913, we were divorced, not because of his mental illness. There were other reasons. But it was a very difficult year for me. It's ironic that I would look to 1914 with such hope. 1914, the year that brought war to our doorstep. I remember a garden party in June of that year. A shadow fell over our assembled crowd. Did you hear the news? Sarajevo, the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, both killed. Where is Sarajevo? A momentary shudder ran through us all. One or two shook their heads and murmured of Austrian reprisals, but to most of us, Sarajevo was a remote place, and we didn't know the Archduke. We gave little thought for international politics. The talk moved on to the latest play and the newest exhibition. I had plans of my own. That fall, I had sublet my apartment. I was going to England to stay near my dear friend, Henry James, and do some writing. But first, I was taking a road trip with friends through Spain. Oh, the Spanish trip was delightful. The roads were new roads lured us on, and the days were hot. But as we crossed the border back into France to stay at Poitiers, one more night before returning to Paris, we began to hear disquieting rumors. All night long, as I lay in my bed in the hotel, young men in the square outside sang the Marseillaise, the French national anthem. Can it be war, we said. We hurried back to Paris, where the air was thick with rumors. And 2 days later, war was declared. When I am told by people who were still in the nursery or not yet born in that fatal year of 1914, that France and England went happily to war, or worse, that France and England forced war on a peace-loving Europe, I am indignant. Let me set the record straight for future generations. Yes, the Allies made mistakes, but those mistakes were made in 1919, when the war was over. In 1914, no one wanted war. France was paralyzed with horror. But once war was declared, it met the challenge with a collective glow of determination. But to people who love peace and beauty, one cannot want a war. We watched the gradual paralysis of Paris. All the men were swooped up and taken to their troops. The War Department threw out their net and gathered every automobile, every auto bus, every taxi cab. Yes, the war was close enough that young men were delivered to their units in taxicabs. And with the men gone, Paris was deserted. The quiet of a city street is so much more quiet than that of a wood or a field. And with the men gone, there were women who needed means of livelihood. So all throughout the city, people opened workrooms where a woman could sew for the war effort and earn a respectable living. Friends of mine began one and asked me if I would do the same. I had never thought anything about something like this at all. But in war, there is enough misery for every hand to find a task. And so I started. I found a supervisor and some seamstresses and some lace makers, and soon we had a thriving business, and there was ardor in the air. Now, we were told when the war began it would just last 6 weeks. And after the Battle of the Marne, that seemed to be true. And so I decided to go ahead. My flat was already leased, and I would go to England to stay near Henry. But once I was in England, I was desperate for news. I would walk to the post office every day, and finally I just paid my bills and went to London, determined to return to Paris, only to find my way blocked. There was to be a great battle near Paris, I was told, and no one was permitted to travel. I went back and forth between the American embassy and the French embassy. Finally, an overworked official said he could get me a pass if I had a passport photo. And this was a new concept at the time. So he gave me an address for a photographer, and I went to the man's house, and he led me around back, up a ladder to a flat shed roof. It was strange, but everything was strange in those days. And he said, "Madam, I must confess, you are the first human being I have ever photographed. Before, I've only photographed wild animals." Well, his photograph was testimony to his art. I looked like a wildcat deprived of her young. But it was enough to get me back to Paris. And once there, I found the woman running my workroom had fled in fear of the advancing German army and taken all the money with her. The room was in shambles. I had to whip it into shape. But the German army drove something else to Paris. Thousands and thousands of Belgian refugees. Their faces were unforgettable. They arrived dazed and stunned, clutching a sordid bundle in one hand and a small child dragging it the other. These were not people who could return to their homes when the war was over. Their homes had been obliterated. They'd been plowing and planting and spinning and weaving when a great cloud of fire and blood had descended upon them. And now here they were in a strange place with a strange language spoken all around them, and only memories of burnt homes and murdered children and things that no eye should see. These are the people who stand by the thousands under improvised shelters, waiting for, in return for everything that makes life sweet, a blanket or a pair of shoes. The French Red Cross was involved with the immense task of military hospitals, and the French Relief Agency was overwhelmed. Friends of mine began their agency and suggested I begin an American agency. Again, I had no clue where to begin, and so I started. My biggest problem was knowing which volunteers to trust. Some would show up and be vague and say, yes, maybe they would help me, and turn out to be my best workers. We worked from 9 in the morning to midnight every day. Others would show up and tell me exactly what I was doing wrong, how to fix it, and never be seen again. I needed a capable lieutenant. My skill was raising money. I needed someone to run the day-to-day operations. And then an American woman I barely knew came and said simply, I want to help. Her name was Elisina Tyler. Elisina took a tottering house of cards and built one of solid bricks and mortar. Never did her energy fail. Never did we disagree. And in 1918, when the war was over, our agency had found homes for 9,000 Belgian refugees. We had found work jobs for 800 women, and we had built 8 hospitals. Let me tell you, that takes a tremendous amount of money. And I want to say right now, I want to thank all of my friends in America. Throughout America, Edith Wharton societies were formed, raising money for our effort, and they worked as tirelessly here as we did in Paris. And I will say I have never forgotten them. Now, one of my most successful enterprises was to edit a book of artwork by European artists. My friend Henry James was featured, and my good friend Theodore Roosevelt wrote the introduction. But in 1915, I had another opportunity. The French Red Cross asked me to visit the trenches and the front lines and write a series of articles. Now, foreign correspondents were strictly excluded from the French front, but they convinced the French generals that if I wrote articles, they'd be printed in America, we could raise money, we could also raise an awareness, and maybe, just maybe, the Americans would join the cause. And so, I set off on a series of 6 expeditions, all the way from Dunkirk in the north, down all the trenches to Belfort in the south. I will never forget the faces of the men as I rode into their camp, either in my motor car or astride a mule, laden with cigarettes and bandages. I remember sharing a meal with them, their reluctant goodbyes, the burden of messages I took back to Paris with me. I remember driving through the villages as we left. Murdered houses and contorted bits of fragments. Black holes that had once been homes along chasms that had once been streets. I remember the trenches and the faces of the men who held it. My first visit was in February of 1915. We were on our way to Verdun, and we were stopped and said we could not go. And then the chief of staff came back and said, "Are you the lady that wrote the book, The House of Mirth? Well, for some reason you can go. But drive quickly. We don't want civilians on the road today." That was the day the French took the heights of Vauquois on the road to Verdun. We watched the battle from a cottage garden through field glasses, as men would run into fire-tongued woods, the boom of the cannon, the answering rap, rap, rap of the gun. We heard with horror the thousands of casualties that day. The French were victorious that day, only to be turned back the next, and 5 days later they took the heights. It was a strategic victory. But at what cost? If all the men who died at the Battle of Verdun stood up, there wouldn't be room for them all to stand on the battlefield. And we went on the next day to Verdun, to the frontline hospitals. Muddy, muddy villages where men were brought from the trenches, encrusted in frozen mud, barely having bathed for months at a time, their feet rotting away from standing in the contaminated water of the trenches. Some of them blind and unable to breathe from the noxious gases they'd been exposed to. And the hospitals were so poorly equipped, the doctors so brave, the men were so brave. I remember one man, he had his head bandaged, and the doctor gently said that he could go back to the trench tomorrow. And the man looked surprised and said, "But I'm going back now," and turned and went back. And we went the other way to make our way back to Paris. We found ourselves in an unusual situation, for the countryside has been completely eradicated. Every signpost, every road, every town. We traveled in a chartless, muddy wasteland, not 60 miles outside of Paris. Another time, I went all the way south to Belfort on the Swiss border. A young dragoon was given to guide us up into the mountains, and as we hiked up, we stopped and looked out at an observation post into the valley below. On one side were the French, and the other the Germans. And in between was no man's land, an evil landscape, saturated with hate, permeated with evil. And as I watched, the guns on the French side came alive, and the Germans answered. Now, I had seen distant battles, and there is a dreadful majesty in distant cannons. But those guns at my feet sounded like all the hounds of hell straining at their leashes. And we quickly retreated and continued our climb. And we came to an opening in the trench and entered into a tortuous burrow, climbing down the hill. There was logs holding the sides up and lattice work keeping our feet above the contaminated water below, and leafy boughs over our head. As we went down, we would pass men sitting on ledges, looking out into that dreadful landscape. They would speak to us, but never once did their eyes move, ever vigilant, ever watching. And finally, we came to a steel enforced door at the end, and we went into what had been an abandoned farmhouse. Nothing remained but the outer walls and some dragoons sitting on what was left of the second floor. Men were lying about, darning socks or writing letters, playing cards, as men do in a camp. But these men were doing those tasks at a whisper, as if around a deathbed. I saw through a crack in the masonry another farmhouse. But these watchers wore helmets of a different shape. Suddenly I was overwhelmed. Why didn't one cannon from the other side annihilate us all? And then I realized there were thousands and thousands of eyes stretching 400 miles from Belfort, where we were, to Dunkirk in the north. Men watching, ever vigilant, lest their small piece of the line be broken. You see it in their eyes more than what they say. Even when they're accepting a cigarette or telling a joke, that look is there. Not of fear, not of resignation, of determination, knowing they might give their life for their country, and they were willing to do it. As we climbed back up the trench, it occurred to me that the men on the far side of the trench had made this war, and those on the near side had been made by it. We went back to Paris, a city of deserted streets and extinguished lamps. Everywhere, it was as suspenseful as being on the front. The news was vague, the enemy baffled but ever menacing. Thousands of stories of young men being hurt, and with no hope of any good to come out of all this destruction. I did have one brief respite from my work during the war years. I had been invited to Morocco to view a business exhibition and write about it. And then the resident general of Morocco gave me a 3-week tour through that country. For 3 weeks, we traveled on desert caravan roads from Tangiers to Mogador to Marrakesh. We visited houses and saw secret gardens with splashing fountains and tile work and plaster lace work. We witnessed religious festivals never before seen by Westerners. To touch the past with one's hands is only realized in dreams. Throughout Morocco was a dreamlike quality, an ancient country of beauty and mystery. Now, Morocco was never a part of the Ottoman Empire. So when the dreadful Sykes Sykes-Picot Agreement was enacted in 1919, Morocco was not affected. Oh, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a terrible, terrible outcome of the war. Two diplomats, Mark Sykes, an Englishman, and Francois-Georges Picot, a Frenchman, created a secret deal to carve up the Middle East so France and England could control the oil. The Arabs were furious. The Arabs were our allies. They had helped us defeat the Turks, and we had made promises to them, promises of self-reliance and self-determination. But instead, those two men created 6 new countries, not paying attention to tribal bounds or any geographic boundaries. There are many people who say the Arab people will become a formidable enemy of the Western world in years to come because of that dreadful Sykes-Picot Agreement. But this was long before that. And my visit to Morocco was like sitting in sunlight after a month of cloudy days. But still, I went back to Paris and resumed my work. As I walked the streets, I could only think of those rat-haunted trenches, of the fathomless mud, of men dying in barbed wire. When you met a friend on the street, your first words were, "Your son? At the front?" A son at the front. This new world has given us a new language. Words like trench and wire and front now have an entirely new meaning to all of us. But for the most part, words weren't necessary. You would simply see the despair in their eyes, and you would know without words being spoken. I shudder at how we endure the unendurable. We began to ask ourselves, for whom is the war being fought? For old men sitting at cafes with the specter of death between them? For mothers disfigured by grief and barely a child left by any of them to carry on the faith for which they believed? And still the war rolled on, alternating threads of triumph and tragedy. But through it all, there was hope. Yes, there was hope. For despite it all, the victory of the French at Verdun showed the inexhaustible strength of the French. The British had joined our side, and other countries, and maybe, just maybe, America would join. For years, us few Americans in the city would go about with a bitter taste of national humiliation on our lips. When the Lusitania was sunk, we thought certainly America would join then. But the Germans promised to restrict their submarine warfare, and Wilson waited. But in January of 1917, the Germans lifted their restriction, and their vicious U-boats attacked anything in the ocean. And in April of 1917, America joined the war. I will never forget those first American troops marching into Paris. They were Negroes, and they were playing a syncopated kind of music called jazz. And we realized they were playing our own national anthem, the Marseillaise, in a jazz style. From then on, jazz was heard throughout Paris, throughout Europe. Let me tell you, jazz music conquered Europe the way no German army ever could. And it was those Negro fighters, the 92nd, the Harlem Hellfighters, that saved Paris. The Germans had marched 40 miles in one day. 40 miles! You must understand, this was a war that was measured in success by a gain of 5 miles. The Battle of the Somme lasted 1 year, and 1 million men died, and the British counted it a victory because they had gained 5 miles. So when the Germans marched 40 and threatened Paris, we were so thankful to those Harlem Hellfighters for saving Paris. And the tide slowly began to turn. It was November of 1918 when a sound drew me to my balcony. The bell in my parish church was ringing. And then another bell joined, and another. And soon all the bells of the churches of Paris were ringing. Could it be? We had lived so long on the thin diet of hope. But then our hearts swelled to bursting along with the bells. The war was over. And 6 months later, I sat on another balcony, that of a friend's, looking out over the Arc de Triomphe as the victorious army marched through, the brasses of the generals glistening, the helmets and the tanks shining in the sun. But I had seen those same helmets and same tanks on the battlefield, spattered with mud and encrusted with blood. And the two visions merged together. At first, we thought we would simply return to the world that we had left before the war. It is good that we had that illusion. For after the brief rapture of victory came the overwhelming realization of grief and loss. 31 million men killed or wounded in this war. An entire generation eradicated, not a house left unscathed. But sorrow comes not alone, and I was at the age when many of my friends and family were making that same journey. I threw myself into my writing. There are those that said my best work was written after the war, but I simply wanted to live in the world I had lived in before the war. And I wrote a book about my New York childhood. My dear friend, Walter Berry, looked at it and said, "Edith, it's a wonderful book, but no one will read it except for you and I." For once, Walter was wrong. Age of Innocence was quite popular. And in 1921, I was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for Literature for Age of Innocence. But today, we live in an angry, somber world. I listen with dread to Hitler on the wireless. He uses all angry screams and accusations of cowardice to anyone who loves peace and beauty. I see little difference between Mussolini's fascism and Franco's dictatorship. We have danced on a growling volcano for too long. Back in 1919, it was General Foch, the great French general, who said the Treaty of Versailles was simply a blueprint for a war 20 years to come. And that war is going to be upon us now. But despite the sadness, I think it's possible to find joy. I still have places I want to visit and countries to visit, books to read, and I hope to write. I take great joy in my friends, in my little dog, in my gardens, and my writing. I wonder what people mean when they say they find emptiness in this great adventure of life. To me, it is like a horizon-wide sunset, piling up the glories as the light begins to fade. I'm afraid I'm incorrigible. Despite all that I've seen, I still love life, and I love wonder, and I love adventure. Thank you so very much. I would be happy to entertain some questions now, if you had some questions. There's a question right there. I'll try to repeat it. Yes, dear.
How old are you?
How old am I? What an impertinent question, young lady. I have seen many years. I'm in my 70s, I'm afraid to tell you. So, yes. I was born in 1964. Can you do the math? Some of the questions. It's hard for me to see the hands. No hands? I've stunned you all into not having... Oh, yes, sir. What was the feeling of Hitler already then? Is what you... We were fearful of him. He was, Hitler had been a soldier in the German army and very angry at the way that the Treaty of Versailles treated the Germans quite terribly. And he was able to rally people to his cause, and we were fearful of his extremism. Even by 33, when he became chancellor, we knew this was a man to be afraid of. We know it, I should say. Yes, ma'am. Yes, I'm seeing you right there. Yes. Was Theodore Roosevelt a family friend? In fact, I'm a cousin of his wife's. So, we run in the same circles, I would say, the Roosevelts and us. Theodore Roosevelt was a dear friend. When he read the book, The Valley of Decision, which was my very first novel, he paraded me for not having the woman get married to the man in the book. But, he came to visit me often. He was like an atom of nuclear energy, a tiny morsel of strength. When he would come, he just was full of energy, and it was an amazing person. And so, yes, we were good friends. Yes.
Did you have any children?
Did I have any children? I'm sorry to say I did not. Teddy and I were not blessed with children. And so I suppose it made the divorce a smidge easier, although it was a difficult time at that point. Yes, Ray.
Were you able to mentor other women or young women writers?
Was I able to mentor other women writers? I suppose there was a young male writer that I mentored. That his name was F. Scott Fitzgerald. Is that his name? Yes. In fact, he based his book, The Great Gatsby, on my book, Glimpses of the Moon. But I tell you, he came to meet me, and his wife, Zelda, didn't want to bother to come to the country. By that time, I had a home outside of Paris, near Versailles. Pavilion Cologne it was called. And he came, he was so nervous to see me, he got quite drunk and made quite a fool of himself. So, way in the back, I see a hand there, yes? Did I have any opportunity to express my opinion regarding warfare to the people in Washington? I did not. I did get an honorary degree from Harvard, but next year, I'm to get a degree from Yale, and I'm not going to go. I can't leave Paris. If the war begins, I need to be here to start my next war effort. So I did not meet with any official and tell them my views, although I think that possibly I might have had some thing to say, but no, I never did. Thank you for asking. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk more about your landscape, or could you talk something about your interest in landscape?
She wanted to know about my interest in landscape. I have to tell you, I was given 35 minutes, so I had to really cut down what I said here today. Yes, I've always been very, very interested in landscape design, and I wrote a book called, after Decoration of Houses, I wrote Italian Villas and Their Gardens. And it was also quite a popular book because people had always seen very formal gardens and in America. And these Italian villas are quite, and there's English gardens and then the Italian gardens are another whole thing altogether. And so the book was quite successful. I am an avid gardener and I have a huge garden of my own. I plant some vegetables, but many, many flowers. My friend Louis Bromfield, who lives here, perhaps you know of him, he's a great writer as well. He lives near me, and we talk about writing and gardening all the time. So gardening is a passion of mine. At my home in America, we didn't stay in that Newport home. We went out to the Berkshires to a house called the Mount. Again, I had to glide over some things. That house is quite a famous garden as well. So I would design famous gardens and write books about them. In fact, my niece, Beatrice Jones, has become the first ever landscape gardener in America because of my influence on her. Yes.
What's some of your favorite flowers?
What's some of my favorite flowers? I do love delphiniums. Did my microphone just go away? Oh, there it is. Okay. It sounded like it went away. I do love delphiniums. Am I on? Okay. All right. Let's see. Check. Okay. Here we are. I do love delphiniums, and I do love like the hollyhocks and long poked ones that are quite tall and give you lots of color in the garden. Gladiolas. Yes.
What was the impetus to write Ethan Frome?
What was the impetus to write Ethan Frome?
Yeah, because it seems so different.
So, okay, it's very good. We lived at the Mount, which was a beautiful home, a spacious mansion we built in the Berkshire Mountains overlooking a lake. And I had many friends come to visit. We would always go out motoring in the countryside during the day and come back at night and have wonderful conversations over dinner. And so I would see these homes, living in the mountains of the Berkshire Mountains, see these homes such as Ethan Frome's home, such as I imagined a house such as that man would live. And so I wrote that book. I actually wrote that book in French first and translated it to English, trying to hone my French writing. So it was sort of I think almost a task for me, I thought. But it ends up, I think it is one of my favorite books that I've written. There is a companion to it called Summer. And it's also set in the Berkshire Mountains, in the poor communities of Berkshire Mountains. And I wrote it during the war. By the end of the war, I became so inured to the pain and tragedy I see around me that I needed to escape. And so every night I would write, a page at the most. But it was an escape for me from the sadness of the war to go back to that place in America where I'd been so happy. And so I wrote Summer. So it's not a sequel to Ethan Frome. It's a companion. They're both written in the same era and the same time place. But Ethan Frome is different from most of my other novels, certainly. I also really cherish writing ghost stories. One of my favorite things to write is ghost stories. I have quite a few books of those as well. So look those up.
Oh.
Some other questions.
Very proud of you, my God.
Well, thank you so very much. Is there some more? Well, then I think we can make a change, sir. If there's no more questions, I'll be happy to answer more. Oh, no,
Okay, good. Oh, good. Ah, there we go. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Wharton.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate that so much for your presentation there. And now let me introduce you to the scholar behind Ms. Wharton, Karen Vuranch. Vuranch. Karen joins us from West Virginia and is a noted Chautauquan and portrays over 10 different, not that anyone's counting, 14 different historical figures. Karen's a retired faculty member at Concord University of West Virginia, where she taught theater, speech, Appalachian studies. She has an undergraduate degree from Ashland University in theater and sociology and a master's degree in humanities from Marshall University, where she majored in American studies. She portrays Edith Wharton in the World War I Legacies of a Forgotten War, Chautauqua, from the years 2016 to 18, and Laura Ingalls Wilder in the Freeland 1862 and the Shaping of Modern America from 2012 to 15. She was here in Grand Island in 2013.